Thank you, Jeff. And I'm really happy to be here after what, 40 years? Nice to repeat. I'm going to talk today about 40 years of work, especially because what you're going to see in the gallery is only the last several years. And so you might wonder, how did I get to where I am now? And because my work, I don't like to think of it as eclectic, but I have had a lot of different interests, and I've worked in a lot of different media, and the content has varied throughout the years. So my job today is to try to tell you what I was thinking about, what I was interested in, what I was trying to express, and the reasons for going from one body of work to another. So a few years ago, I had a show, kind of a mini retrospective in Columbia, Missouri. I called it Bookends because it started with this piece and ended with the portraits that I've been showing in the gallery, that I'm showing in the gallery. So it was like 40 years or 35 years. Portraits in the beginning and portraits at the end. So this is, well, first of all, Jeff told you, I studied at UCLA, and I got a Fulbright in 67, to go to Florence to study printmaking, which I did. And I stayed on a couple of years beyond the Fulbright, and then decided, okay, you either go back to the States and grow up and get a job, or stay in Florence. And I wanted to stay in Florence. I loved living there. And with a couple of friends, we started the Graphic Arts Center in Santa Carta in Florence in 1970. And I lived in Florence permanently for 14 years. So what you're going to see in this show is a lot of Italian influence, lots of it, everywhere, including this. I mean, these have a kind of, they're not really Italianate, but certainly they, these, let me go to the next one here. They certainly do have, pay homage to Renaissance portraiture, or even earlier portraiture, Roman portraiture, in which the profile was the normally used idea. And so this one, I call this my Holbein print, because Hans Holbein and other 16th century artists, especially in England, would do these very severe frontal or, in this case, side portraits. But this has a kind of a nice green background. That's what made me think of some of the Holbein pieces, portraits that are so beautiful. And so at that time, I was an etcher. That's all I really did, is I did color etchings, and sometimes a black and white etching, but mostly in color, and there are 3 plates. So any of you who are printmakers, and any of you who have done etchings, know that it's a fairly labor-intensive process. Consequently, a print like this might have taken me 2 or 3 months to work on, or at least a couple of months anyway. So clearly I couldn't do that many images in a year. And that is something that I'll come back to in a bit as to why I changed from an etcher to something else. These are just a scale. This is not this big. So they're not really very big prints. They're certainly not tiny. There's another one. I did these portraits, self-portraits, for about 3 or 4 years. And that is typical of me. I tend to, when I have an idea, I like to push it as far as I can push it. And very frankly, I sometimes push it too far and realize that I'm repeating myself. And it's time to move on. And I think I have, my wife would certainly attest to this, a certain ability to concentrate for a long period of time on things. I guess I'm an obsessive person, at least partially, and I got interested in pencil drawings, colored pencil drawings. This thing is no bigger than about this, 6 inches by 6 inches, and it probably took me 30 or 40 hours, because colored pencil drawing, the way I did it, I built it up in layers. It takes a long time, which means you're sitting there, and, you know, on a good day, I might have done that. This was a lot faster because that's just regular pencil. So at this point, I had left behind the 77. I had left behind the portraits, and we, by that time, had found a lovely little village out in the Tuscan countryside, which we lived in, even though it wasn't livable. And it's in a very remarkably beautiful area with mountains. It's a national forest, actually. Well, I did some paintings where I actually painted all the trees, but I really didn't want to do that. So this is more of a metaphorical landscape in which all those little pyramid-like shapes kind of represent this sweep of the landscape. And of course, the trope here is that this looks like a collage, but it isn't. I mean, I drew it that way, but they're not glued on top of each other. I thought there was another one. Let me go back. This one. Oh. Okay. This is a big drawing for me. Big, like 10 inches. And technically, it also is layered. So I would start with a chalk drawing underneath, and then layer on colored pencil very, very slowly in this imaginary wall with these 6 portals, looking out again on one of these landscapes. And because our house is up on a hill, which I really like because you can see things, you'll see that later with all the landscapes, they're almost all from a high vantage point, looking down. That is my preferred landscape, is one where I'm looking down at something or out at something, but not. That's why I left the Midwest. I was born in Springfield, Illinois. There are no hills. And I could hardly wait to get out to some place where there were hills. Here's a tiny little series of drawings that are almost this big. And this was actually based on our little village. It's abstracted, of course, but that little shape there is a chapel. There's a chapel in the village that was completely ruined, and a friend and I put the roof on. So we really did stuff. And of course, there's cypress trees and all the rest. There's the chapel again. I rearranged it a little bit with this. About 1985, I started to think that because I had been making etchings that were extremely labor intensive and doing drawings that were extreme, I started to think, I think I have more than 6 or 7 ideas a year. It was just too slow, and I thought, maybe I'm too restricted. So I started making monoprints, and printmakers use monoprints because it's fast. You can get something really, you can do one in a day or in an hour. Well, me being me, of course, mine took 25 hours each one. But still, that was faster than, and there's no additions. So by the time I got to this point, I started in '85 on these monoprints. They're watercolor monoprints, and not many people at that time seemed to know that watercolor and water media work great for monoprints. Most people that I had seen were using oil-based inks and things like that. But the watercolor worked great. I paint on plexiglass plates with just 2 watercolors. I don't use those anymore. Full line, those kind of things, and 2 plates, and then a 3rd plate with a rolled-on color which formed the shadows and things like that. And the trouble is, it just takes a lot of time to do it if you're going to be as detailed as I like to be. So these were imaginary places. These don't exist because I think by that time I really had absorbed this Tuscan landscape, the Italian landscape, so much that I really didn't need to go out and draw. There was one time, actually, it's interesting. Somebody was fixing up a house, and they had a little loggia where I could work. I thought, well, why don't I go out and just paint right on the scene? It didn't work because I was too restricted by what was out there. I didn't want to be a realist. I wanted to make things up and see what happened. And technically, my prints all started like abstract expressionist paintings. Very loose and sloppy and things, because if you're going to do things that are really loose, you got to do them right at the beginning. And that's the way this started. If you saw this after 2 hours, it wouldn't have made any sense at all. And then gradually the ideas flow. I would turn the plates over and maybe make some marks on the back of the plate. I work on a light box, by the way, so I could see that I could form the construction of the piece. And that started a long series. I love Roman numerals. The galleries hate it because they didn't know how to read these things. But I like Roman numerals. So this is only 32. There's about 100 in this series. Let's see, 100 times 25 hours. I also did some of the paintings. This is a pretty large painting. This is for me, anyway. Maybe 6 feet, 7 feet long. And I started to make these imaginary places with imaginary walls, but not really imaginary paintings. I was borrowing paintings from books, from record covers, from any source, and repainting them as if they were frescoes that have been out in the weather and starting to cherry print. Here's another. This is also me. So anybody who's been to Italy knows that not everything's in good shape. They have an awful lot of stuff, and sometimes they can't restore it. I just think of the Last Supper. You know, it's almost illegible, but that for me is very fascinating. So one of the themes that runs through all of this work is that when you get a wall in Italy and you scratch it, something's under there. You scratch that and there's something under that. And so the whole idea of pentimento and palimpsest, if you know that word, where you can see through one layer into something else, goes through all of my work. And like a lot of the series we call pentimento. So here's the series. It's the same series that you were looking at. C, meaning 100. That's the 100th one in that particular series. And I would say that most people would say this is fairly realistic. It looks like a real place. But it's not. It was all made up. And I like the idea of having the landscape really tiny in the distance. This follows another series that I'm not showing that were just pure landscapes. Gradually, the landscapes got smaller and smaller and smaller, and the architectural features got bigger. And I did, well, this is 79. So we're up to 1990. By that time, I'd left Italy. I left in 81. But I went back every summer. I've always gone back every summer for 3 months or 4 months. So I have a studio there. And so this was almost certainly made there. Well, maybe not. I can't remember. This is the perfect example of what I was talking about. So, this imaginary building, somebody at one point needed an archway and a doorway. But then 100 years later, they didn't need that. And they were going to do something else to the building, so they walled it up. And then at a later date, there was another structure that was there, and you can see that, and then that got covered up, and then finally there was some kind of a cornice, who knows why, and that's, you see this. If you go to Italy, you will see that. There's a wonderful wall, I don't have a photograph of it, in Lucca, which is near Florence, and it was a Roman amphitheater, which is now kind of a piazza that's oval kind of market. But outside, there's the original portals of the entryway to the amphitheater. There's lots of them. This is one. So you've got these big Roman stones, at the same time as the Colosseum in Rome. And then there's a whole bunch of stones that are clearly from the Middle Ages. And then there's plaster from the 19th century. And then there's the 20th century window. All of them in the same wall. And so that's the metaphor that I use. The idea that behind what you see, there's something else. And behind that, there's something else. This is one that got shown actually at the National Gallery of Art at the Smithsonian, a show of the monotype in America. I forget the woman's name who curated. It was a wonderful show that I was lucky to get into, and this is from that show.
And what are the scales on these?
These are 36 inches by 12, 12 by 36 mostly. Yeah, they're not very big, but big enough. This is really interesting for me because that rectangle there, Meredith and I went to Cinque Terre, which everybody discovers, and all the kids are there now, and you don't want to go there. But anyway, the days that we went, it was totally overrun by college students. And we went up to one of the towns, there's 5 of them. And at the top, there was a little tiny piazza where the kids were playing soccer. And they had made on the wall a goal, painted on it, just like that. But this came first. I found the goal after I had done this piece. And it was strange. I mean, God, I did that several years ago. And they did it too. So here's another one of those things where instead of being painted on the wall, somebody had painted a fresco of a Tuscan landscape, and then somebody made this thing and probably made it into the goal. But then there's this other one that got kind of broken over the years. This is a new one called Vestiges. Same idea, really. Vestiges are pretty much the same thing. Our house in the country is about 3 miles from a wonderful town called Popi that has a beautiful castle, started in the year 1000 and made into a real castle, actually a castle that was used. Dante actually stayed there for a while. And in the entryway, there's this really irregular piazza, I'm missing the word, but so it's an enclosed space. And over the centuries, the chief of police that would be hired from another place would leave his stem, his coat of arms. And so it's all. Well, I didn't want to do the coat of arms, but I did want to do all these little pieces that were inspired by the coats of arms because they didn't put them in a grid. They're just willy-nilly everywhere. And it's really beautiful. And that was the inspiration for this particular piece. And then you can hardly see it because the slide's a little dark, but I had a fleeting interest in Last Judgments. There's lots of them. And I think there are books that only have Last Judgments, and they're fabulous. I think it was their way of really tapping into stuff that normally you wouldn't expect to see, because they very often were illustrating the deadly sins. You can imagine what some of those might be. For example, gluttony, a figure that's being stuffed with something. And then, of course, some of the other things. And the devils in these pictures are amazingly creative, because who's really seen the devil? But it gave them an idea that they could then elaborate on. And so my devil is up there. It's a winged devil. And he's a little hard to see. But I did a whole bunch of them and really found it extraordinarily interesting and fun. And actually, there's a couple of devils, at least one devil in the show that you're going to see. This I guess this was inspired by the side of the Church of Santa Croce in Florence. It has some pointed arches. And I very often work in a mini-series. You only do one. I mean, you can't repeat the watercolor. So you only get one. That's why it's called a monoprint. But after you've printed it, after you run it through the press, there's a residue left. And we call it the ghost. And the ghost is, and sometimes there's quite a lot of paint, but it's degraded. Well, for me, that's great. I deal in degraded things. And so inevitably, I would do 2 or maybe even 3 from the same plate, but I would take that degraded image and then paint into it. So there's 3 of these. I hope all 3 are here. I'm not even sure of the order here. Whoops. There's only one. It's too bad, because there's 3 of these. And little parts show up on the succeeding prints. I guess I felt I had to not put too many things in. So, this is 92. By 94, I've been making monoprints for how many years? Whatever. And I got interested, quite by accident, in the idea of working with computers and computer technology. I didn't know anything more than just, we didn't have email either, but I knew rudimentary things. And a friend of mine on the faculty said, are you interested in learning some animation and stuff like that? And I got this chance to go out and take a course and I'll pay you way. So I said, yeah. And I, in '94, went out and worked with, for 1 week with software that they called, it was by Wavefront Technologies. It was called Direct. It actually became Maya. Any of you know Maya? This was the early version. And with no instructions, no book, no easy way to do anything. But I was really fascinated by it. And so I wanted to make some prints. The problem was, in 1994, so you do something on a computer, how do you print it? Well, there weren't any really good ways to print. I mean, nothing permanent, nothing that printmakers would. So I got a grant from the school, from my university, to study the different ways of making prints on a computer that could then be printed in an acceptable way for printmaking. And so this is one of them. I don't think that anybody's probably done waterless lithos here. It's never caught on. But anyway, they were really interesting plates. But the point being that this was completely done on a computer. It was a 3D animation program in which you model whatever it's going to be. You model the columns, you model those things, you model some steps, you model everything, and those are there. And then you put them together like toys, like Legos, move them around on the computer, of course. And then what I did was I texture mapped it with some text that I ran into one night. Meredith and I were at Kinko's. And there was a kind of he looked like a street person. He was a pretty weird looking guy. He was madly photocopying. And so we had to wait our turn. We finally left. And he had thrown a lot of stuff away, made a lot of mistakes. I think he was from Jews for Jesus, but I don't know for sure. If anyone of you ever heard of that, is it a cult? I don't know. This stuff was fantastic because it was printed things on which he had made marginal notes in his handwriting and little arrows and things commenting on this text. And I took it all out of the trash. Who knows? Maybe I'll get sued one day by somebody from Jews for Jesus. And I have mined that stuff ever since because it's not my handwriting. I could never do that. The references were so delirious. They were just wonderful. It was like being in, I don't know, Buñuel films. So what I did is, they were flat things, but I texture mapped them around the columns and around everything, as if you're walking to some place, and some really mad guy had graffitied the whole thing. So this is actually printed by hand on a lithopress, and it's actually a duotone. To make it richer, I printed it from 2 plates, and I did a bunch of these. And then this is actually a polymer plate. Solar plate. So you can see this is really obsessive, isn't it? I like it because of that. So, but this was again all done on the 3D animation. So I never made I did one animation, and I actually showed it at what was the gallery? I showed it at the Smith Gallery here. I did a hanging curtain that flowed backwards. Elliott Smith had a big show there, and that was the only video that I've ever made. But it's like on the computer, you make all this stuff in 3D, and then you kind of wander around in the scene, and you snap pictures. And so, which at the time, I'm talking about middle 90s, that sounded pretty interesting. I guess today, doesn't sound very interesting, but for me it was, 94, 95. And so this is printed by hand. This is like an intaglio plate, printed by hand on an etching press. So these are additions. But sooner or later, I got tired of working on a computer. So I work on a computer all the time, in part for what I do now. But I really missed painting. I'm an old guy who grew up painting and drawing, and I wasn't willing to give up the use of the hand. It's not the same with a mouse, it's not the same with a digital tablet. They can tell you it is, but it's not. It's not like having a pencil or a paintbrush in your hand. There's just no way to duplicate that experience. And so I went back to painting monoprints, but so I imagined these architectural situations, archaeological situations, as if you were flying over them. I call it the Agora series, or the Italians say Agora, they put an accent at the end. Agora, you may know the word Agora, as in agoraphobia, which is people who are afraid of open spaces. But Agora really meant a marketplace. It was the Greeks used the Agora as the marketplace. But then there's the metaphor of the marketplace of ideas. So in Italy, our first internet provider was called Agora. An Agora, a marketplace of ideas. So this is an Agora. And so is this. And so I imagined these places seen from maybe a helicopter or something. And with columns, all of which define the space with the shadows, so they tell you how high things are, what they are. And I had been making polymer plates. Those are these solar plates with a lot of the text that I had borrowed from our friend at the Kinko's and other things. And I found that those plates, they're steel with a polymer surface. If I painted, I'm on a light box here, and I paint with the watercolor and I leave it for a while, and I put this plate down and rub it, I can blot it, and it leaves an impression. So a lot of these textures were done like that, including this one. I got interested in codes and text. I was interested in text, but then I got really interested in coding and codes. Read a book about codes and stuff. I ran into a code called the Vigenère code, which is simply, it's a real simple code. You could learn it in 20 minutes. It's the alphabet, and moved over one space, and the alphabet, and of course, it goes like that. And then you have a key to the whole thing. You have a key phrase, which somebody has to know. Well, I liked it visually. It was really beautiful. It's A, B, C, D, D, and I use that in a lot of pieces. And so that's what you're seeing underneath these little tiny ones. Basically, this book on codes had it printed on a page. I just scanned it, made a plate out of it, and then used it in so this is a small series, which I call the Enigma series. There's a whole new movie out now about the Enigma code of the Nazis that was broken by the English. Have you seen that? Have you seen about that film? It's coming out now. Who's the guy? What's his name? The actor?
Dennis Olsen.
Yes, never remember his name. It's impossible. Well, he's playing the part of one of the key players in breaking the Enigma code, which was the Germans' unbreakable code. And so that's what this whole series is about. And, well, not always, but I was also thinking of framing devices. So everything in this series, and these are really small prints, about this big. I've done 50, 60, 70 of them. They all have some kind of framing device and something inside. And then, I only showed you one out of the 60. I went through a period in which I was just working very abstractly, and I wanted to not work with the same materials, and so I worked at the litho press with litho inks and these solar plates that I made. And so I could roll out the ink, put the plate in there, or I could ink up the plate. But so there were all kinds of things I could do. And that's what this little series of prints, I think I have more than one. They're tiny. They're about this big. They had kind of a Japanese feel, I thought. They sort of had that quality of Japanese prints. And then, in 6, I don't know even how I got, oh, I know how I got interested. One of my graduate students came into my printmaking class. He was a sculptor. He was working with clay. And he wanted to do something, and he was very conceptual and stuff. And he came with this big lump of clay and wanted to run it through the etching press, but was not having much luck. And I said, you obviously have never made pasta. If you've ever made pasta, you have a little pasta machine, right, with little 2 wheels, but you don't take a big lump and try to run it through. You open the wheels, and then you run it through, and it gets thinner and thinner and thinner. So I showed him how to do it. And actually, no, it wasn't clay, it was porcelain he was using. And I thought, wow, that is really nice stuff. Porcelain clay, when you touch it when it's wet, it's sensual, it's beautiful. And I thought, I could make some plaques. I had already talked with my friend in the ceramics department about making some things. I wanted to do something, but I never really pursued it. And then I realized I could. And I have all these solar plates with all this, this stuff on it, and they're in relief, so I could push them into the porcelain and get images. And then I could paint with what looks like watercolor. They call them, I forget. They're kind of glazes, a particular kind of glaze that's water-based. And so I started making these porcelain tablets. And they basically were like my work. I mean, they have parts that look like they've been eroded. Here's one, this is about this big. And it was pretty fast to do them, and then I fired them, but they came out of the oven pretty raw, and so I had to polish them, and that's where all the work came, polishing. But I loved it. I mean, it was really a nice sensation to polish these things down. And porcelain is such a beautiful material to work with, both when it's wet and after it's dry. Here's another one. So all of the textures came from those polymer plates that I've been making, because they have, and anything I can scan, I can put on a tablet. So since I was interested in text, I was also interested in books and references. So I made a whole bunch of these books out of porcelain and different ways of binding. We have a friend, 2 friends actually, who are musicologists, and they study really old music, 9th, 10th century, and sometimes as late as the Renaissance. And they have given me, both of them have given me stuff that they photographed for their work, which then I scan and I put in here. So some of the stuff has music from the 10th century, the 11th century. And actually, this I think I found in a book was a beautiful schematic drawing of a Chinese city. And I duplicated it, and so it's a kind of a left-right thing. But it was a beautiful thing. It looked like a computer design, but it was actually a Chinese city. And then, in making these I did all in Italy, in the basement of our house. This is really messy, working with clay. I'm down in the basement there. I can make a mess. So I roll out the porcelain, like rolling out pizza dough. And then, generally, I would have too much information. I would cut it down, and then there'd be all this stuff at the edge that I would just throw away. And I looked at it and thought, some of this stuff is really good. What if I would have made pendants for my wife Meredith out of porcelain? And that's what I started doing. I've made a couple hundred of them. She's wearing them right now. And here they are. They're only about that big. And I love doing it. It's really fun.
Dennis, as contemporary as they look, they also look like artifacts that you're digging out of an archaeological site.
Absolutely. Well, that's the intention, of course.
Yeah.
They look, and the only trouble is porcelain is really, really delicate in the sense that if you drop it, it breaks. And so you have to be really careful. But what I really wanted to do is to get the effect of jade. Meredith's mother was a collector of Asian art, and we now have her collection of jade. And jade is the most sensuous material you can imagine. You touch it, and it's just like a baby's bottom. It's fantastically beautiful and smooth, and that's the look I wanted these to have, as if they were made out of jade. So we're back to monoprints. Remember my friend I talked about who's studies old music. This stuff here is from probably the 10th century. He is the world expert on Benedictine chant. Benevento is a town south of Rome, and there's a particular chant that they did way before Gregorian chant. And he's the world expert. He can read that and he can sing that. And so he gave me a whole bunch of files from his research. And then his wife Peggy is a wonderful printmaker painter, and we visited one time, and she was working with piano rolls. You know what a player piano is? You did. Well, there's rolls, and it's like a computerized thing, right?